be. We've got a couple of other cameras that are up just inside this vehicle. This one seems to have a wee bit of a problem, though. No, it doesn't. No, sorry, it's just a monitor in front. This is Kirk Spitzer, a colleague of mine, who is the former Pentagon correspondent from USA Today, who is taking on the role of navigating us through the difficult ground and terrain of the battlefield. He's found this an interesting experience as well. We were driving yesterday in soft, fluffy sand ruts that were up to 2.5 feet deep, really testing the ground clearance of this vehicle. The sand has a consistency almost like talcum powder on occasion, and it gets up into everything in the vehicle. We had to change out the air filter, the fuel filter today. There's a lot of maintenance that's out of the realm of the ordinary when it comes to being a correspondent or an engineer. We also have one other camera here. We're not rolling yet, so it doesn't really have the intended effect. This is Randall Joyce sitting in the front, who is our esteemed producer out of our London bureau, as well as Kirk and myself. And the only camera that the only person that the camera doesn't pick up this morning is Patrick Starlin, who is our engineer who put this whole thing together. And now that the Marine has cleared the field of view out front, we'll show you a look out front as well. That's the camera that will catch all of the action as we're rolling forward.
Well, John, it still looks pretty dusty out there to me. It looks pretty sandy
50 miles an hour across open desert.
Looks pretty sandy out there still.
Dan, this is actually a beautiful day. This is actually a beautiful day. We had a little bit of light rain this morning, which, of course, keeps the dust down, and everyone's thankful for that. Cools off the air a little bit, too. We have a little bit of cloud cover in the sky, so the sun isn't really beating down as strongly as it was yesterday. It may look a little bit sandy. There's always a haze in the air. A little bit of that's cloud. It's actually a very nice day here in the southern Iraqi desert, and we're all thankful for that.
John Roberts, live on video phone from somewhere in the northern part of southern Iraq. John, if you can stand by, we're going to switch over to another of our CBS News combat correspondents, Jim Axelrod, who is with the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, the 1st Brigade, 3rd Battalion. We mentioned that Jim's report was subject to military review. It's subject to military review. On the phone and on the move inside Iraq. Jim, what is happening on this day 2 of the drive to Baghdad?
Well, Dan, day 1, the bottom line was almost a victory parade for the 3rd Infantry Division. They walked into the country and moved en masse in that column of vehicles and troops, and they encountered no resistance, saw virtually no Iraqi troops, and moved in a rapid rate of speed, unimpeded, about 6 hours well inside the border. That's changed today. Overnight, elements of the 3rd Infantry Division experienced their first significant battle, their first significant active engagement. Now, it's not the 1st Combat Brigade we're with. It was the 3rd Combat Brigade that engaged with elements of the 11th Iraqi Division, and we're being told, and I quote one of the captains that we deal with in terms of getting information, things went very well, that there were thousands and thousands of surrenders, not capitulation. They did not give up. They surrendered after a very active battle overnight, and that some key objectives were seized as well by this 3rd Combat Brigade and the 3rd Infantry Division. Bottom line here as well, Dan, no American casualties reported in the fighting. Dan?
Jim, when we spoke earlier today with a lieutenant colonel from the 3rd Infantry Division, he mentioned a couple of things I want to follow up on. One, he said that elements of the 3rd Infantry Division had crossed the Euphrates River into the Tigris-Euphrates Valley region. Has there been very much movement there, or can you say, or do you know?
Well, the elements that we are with, the brigade we are with, has not crossed. I can tell you that the key focus for the brigade we are with is securing some river crossings. What you're reporting is news to me if they've crossed the Euphrates River, because we have been told all along that the movement will maintain west of the Euphrates as they push north until certain objectives are seized, and then there will be a decision to cross. So the group I am with and the elements of the 3rd Infantry Division I am with have not gone over and had not planned to, at least through the rest of the movement north for the foreseeable 12, 24-hour period. Dan?
So for the sake of our viewers, for clarity, There was no question that the colonel we spoke to this afternoon said some elements of the 3rd Infantry Division had crossed the Euphrates River. But what Jim is telling us now, well, it may be true. I can myself consider it unquestionably true that some elements did cross the Euphrates, that by far most of the 3rd Infantry Division remains west of the Euphrates. Now, if we can go to our map here for just a moment. Stand by, Jim, because we're going to do a little map work here for just a second. As best we can figure out, we're not going to give you any precise positions, of course, but the elements of the 3rd Infantry Division that Jim Axelrod is reporting are roughly in this area around El Asaria. That town has been talked about, and more about that later. They have been west of the Euphrates River. Keep in mind the Tigris River, which runs through Baghdad, is over here in the eastern part of the country. The Euphrates, which begins up in Syria, is over here. And the 3rd Infantry has by and large been west of the Euphrates. Now, the Lieutenant Colonel we talked to this afternoon said flatly that at least some elements have now crossed the Euphrates into this biblical, historical Mesopotamia Valley. But so far, most of the infantry division is staying west, and that's the point that Jim was making. Now, Jim Axelrod, I also want to follow up with the combat. The Apache longbows, which have the capacity to knock out tanks, they're the best tank-killing helicopter in the world by far. They were engaged in knocking out some Iraqi tanks, as I understand it. But there was at least a bit of a tank battle during the last 24 hours. Is that your understanding, and what can you tell us about that?
Well, I can tell us that the Apache certainly have become a much more critical part of the battle plan as far as the 3rd Infantry is concerned. We saw a number. Again, the military is sitting very tight on a stand in terms of reporting exactly what numbers. But we did see several battalions of Apaches move to an area in Jalaba, a military airfield, and staged there precisely to be used in the tank battles, the kinds of things that you're talking about in terms of offering air support. As you say, the Apaches are these incredibly sophisticated, fierce attack machines, and they've clearly moved to the forefront in terms of strategy of protecting the troops as the 3rd Infantry continues to push north and west as they continue to flank that side of the country on the push to Baghdad. It will be, it is expected that the troops will encounter much more resistance than they've seen so far, and this is where the Apaches become critical. So we have seen movement, we have seen rebasing and repositioning of the helicopters, and we are being told that they will now be much more involved in shaping the battlefield. Dan, let me just also follow with the point that as we were trying to sort out this business about the Euphrates River. The battle last night that I'm talking about was all about seizing the objective that would allow, the objective that was being seized was about the ability for the 3rd Infantry, elements of the 3rd Infantry, especially the 3rd Brigade, to be able to go over the Euphrates. So we should clear up, as long as you're reporting it from this other source, I can confirm it, that that's exactly what was being talked about.
Jim, George S. Patton, famous for his armored dash across northern France, which broke the back of the German resistance in World War II, he once said that once an armor unit particularly gets on the move, that it was his philosophy of be audacious, be audacious, be audacious. Now, it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, with what's happening here is not a version of that, that there is some caution that the unit, the 3rd Infantry, moves swiftly, then stops, look and listen, regroup, maybe put their Patriot missiles in defense, maybe establish a base camp, a base-up operation with the helicopters, and then move on again. Is that the case or not?
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening. Picture a game of leapfrog, if you will, in which there are sort of 3 players. So the 3rd Infantry Division would be divided into these 3 brigade combat teams, and one will go ahead, secure the area. As you say, secure and shape a certain area, have the Patriots, have the various artillery support systems, get the Apaches in place. And then you'll see one of the other brigades sort of pass through and move to another position, securing that position, and then another brigade will come by. So it's a game sort of leapfrog that allows the infantry division as a whole to move with the kind of speed that they're looking for, but at the same time marries it up to a degree of safety and security that is the other objective. That's sort of the way it moves. A great deal of deliberation, but because they've encountered no resistance to this point, they're moving at a rate of speed that they've been quite satisfied with so far. So audacious, I'm not sure. Rapid and safe, most certainly, to this point, Dan.
Jim Axelrod, with you, when you talk to, let me ask you, you get a chance to talk to captains and sergeants, the two grades of people who know the most about what's really going on. But with whomever you're speaking, what's their rough estimate? What's their best hope of being at the gates of Baghdad? Another 2 or 3 days, or do they know?
I think, again, the critical phases in terms of answering that question will lie in the next 24 hours. We should have a much better fix as to what kind of resistance, if any at all, the elements of the 3rd Infantry will encounter because of the route that they will be following over the next 24 hours. If everything goes smoothly, and when I say smoothly, I mean if everything is more or less in accordance with expectations. I don't think it is outside the realm of possibility to be in Baghdad on the gates of Baghdad in 3 days. I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility at all.
But that would depend on continuing to have, while pockets of resistance, and in some cases, as was the case last night with part of the 3rd Infantry, some occasional but fierce resistance, it all depends on how much resistance. And Jim, I want to ask you, is there talk among the troops that Saddam Hussein has not unleashed his chemical and biological weapons, the weapons that the United States so firmly believe he has, at least up to this point? He has not unleashed any of those at even the advancing U.S.-led troops.
You know, it's the concern with the captains and the sergeants, as you mentioned, is something I've seen, say, in the last 24 hours or so. I've seen much more of this sort of chemical tape that they wear around their legs and on their uniforms as an indicator. It's going on the vehicles. I don't think it's at this point any more of a concern in terms of preparation than it has been, but it certainly is in the minds. And I think, Dan, that's because of a certain vacuum that exists right now. It's impossible to stress too much what the first 24 hours of the ground war did in the hearts and minds of the soldiers we've talked to. Remember, no resistance. So it couldn't have gone smoother. And I know that the officers are concerned about protecting against the sense of overconfidence. What you see in the sergeants and the captains and the privates and the specialists, because of this sort of, for especially the guys who haven't seen much combat before, in terms of guarding against overconfidence, you tend to focus on, okay, what could be out there? What still exists and still remains as a possibility that could change the tide and the pace and the rate of our, in their minds, of the military's successful march. And I think that the first thing on people's minds at that point is going to be the chemical and biological threat. So a sense of sort of heightened awareness, well, couldn't get much higher than they walked out here to begin with. But because there's not a great deal of POWs to focus on, there's not a great deal of casualties to focus on, I think that what's sort of taken the place in the vacuum is this threat. It's got to be coming in their minds. Dan?
Jim Axelrod, I remember being with the 3rd Infantry in northern Kuwait, maybe a week or 10 days ago, when they were preparing to move into Iraq, and we profiled a squad. And I thought to myself at the time, most Americans don't realize that down in the ranks, we're talking now about the privates, mostly the privates, they're about 19 and a half years old, I would say was the average age in that squad. How are these men, they are men, but still very young men who a year and a half, 2 years ago were still in high school, how are they holding up on this, and what's their reaction to rolling across the desert, finding, running across some resistance, but what's their reaction and how are they holding up?
Dan, I think that's been among the most compelling parts of the story for me, is seeing an 18 or 19-year-old kid, they razor in the rear-view mirror of their Humvee in the morning, and you kind of feel like maybe they haven't been doing that for very long. These are young kids. I've talked to any number who have said, yeah, a year ago I was in high school. Can you imagine that? I think, experiencing now, after this first day, day and a half, this sense of what their expectation was and what reality is. And I asked one in particular, was battle what you expected? And he kind of shook his head and said, it was exactly what I feared, in terms of his nervousness, in terms of realizing when it's for real, that as much as you can train and as much as you can prepare yourself, there is still no substitute for realizing all the marbles are on the table. And this was a guy who had been through the first 6 or 7 hours of a ground war where they hadn't seen anything other than some Bedouins waving to him on the side of the road as they drove by. So you have to think that once they do encounter their first significant combat, whereas they are well trained, they're certainly well commanded, well supplied, there is no substitute for that first time, and there's no completely adequate preparation for the first time you're facing artillery or bullets or any kind of combat situation. Dan?
Jim Axelrod with the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division reporting live from his unit is still west of the Euphrates River, and he reports that most of the 3rd Infantry is still west of the big river. War has caused pain and suffering for centuries in the Middle East. Longtime CBS News consultant and Johns Hopkins University professor Fuad Ajami is with me now to help sort through this current conflict. Fuad, we've been talking about down in the ranks where wars and won and lost, men in boots. Let's take a wider shot. What lies ahead on the road if American forces do succeed of not just getting to the gates of Baghdad, but like the Mongols and others before them, move through those gates and take over? What's ahead?
Well, I want to stay with the poetic imagery that you rightly noted. These young kids who are racing toward the gates of Baghdad, these young kids, and this is who's carrying out this campaign. We are racing toward an American stewardship of Iraq. This is really what these men are going for Baghdad. We are going to end up as the stewards of Iraq. And think of it this way, an imperial circle is being closed right this minute. Iraq was invented by the Brits in 1921. Now we are racing to remake Iraq, and it will be our responsibility. And this is what these young boys and their commanders are coming into, this imperial inheritance and this responsibility.
As we learned as a result of Vietnam, and history is replete with examples, there are limits to power, yes. Even the limits of a superpower such as the United States.
Yes.
A reach too far?
Well, earlier today in another discussion you were talking about this reach of this American empire. And what's remarkable about this reach of this American empire is it's being done with only 3.5% to nearly 4% of our GDP, which is much lower than the percentage of military expenditures.
GDP being gross
domestic product, which is much less than we were spending in the days of the Cold War. So we are achieving this preponderance in the world with much less expenditures than we used to devote to military in the days of the Cold War. There is no precedent to this primacy. And this man in his bunker, Saddam Hussein, if he's dead or, we don't know if he's dead or alive, but this man never understood what kind of power lies in wait for him, what kind of military technology has been developed in the last dozen years or so since he met us the last time around in the last war.
So bottom line is you think it's doable?
Well, this is it. We shall rule Iraq, and we now have to begin to think about how we make this country work, how we keep the ambitions of Turkey and Iran to their limits, and so on. It's our destiny.
Fuad Ajami. Hope we'll have a chance to talk more later. You're watching CBS News continuing coverage of America at war.
This CBS News special report is part of our continuing coverage of America at War. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
The headlines at this hour. Day 3 of the Second Gulf War has begun with more huge explosions in the center of Baghdad and just outside the city. You heard some of the thunderous explosion This is a nighttime scene, but the explosions continued in daylight in Baghdad for the first time in this Gulf War. More Iraqi troops are surrendering in the south, including one entire division, an estimated 8,000, mostly conscript in the way of troops. 8,000 of the regular Iraqi army. That was near the city of Basra. Other units of the U.S.-led force are rolling north, meeting sporadic resistance, in some cases fierce. They're on their way to Baghdad, but they are going at a fast go, then stop a while to regroup, and then move on. 2 U.S. Marines have been killed by enemy fire. That's in addition to the 4 U.S. Marines who died in a helicopter crash. The cause of that crash not yet determined. Turkey is finally allowing U.S. aircraft to overfly through its airspace, opening the way for U.S. troops to be flown into northern Iraq to try to keep the peace between Kurds, Turks, and Iraqis. But Turkey is also sending more of its own troops across the border into northern Iraq against the specific and expressed wishes of President Bush. Anti-war protests flared today in Turkey and in several Arab capitals. In Cairo, Egyptian police used water cannon against the crowds there. In this country, some hundreds of people were arrested in a second day and night of protests. 2 Marines have become the first Americans killed by enemy fire. They apparently were shot to death by Iraqis in separate incidents, both inside Iraq. Their identities have not been disclosed. The first 4 Americans to make the ultimate sacrifice in this war were killed when their helicopter crashed in Kuwait. It's the whole country's loss, but Harold Dow reports now on the families who lost the most.
At the same time the bombs reverberated through Baghdad yesterday, in the small coastal fishing village of Port Clyde, Maine, a father spoke of why so many brave men and women are prepared to die for their country.
It seems to be a war that probably needs to be done.
Corporal Brian Kennedy was one of 4 U.S. Marines who died when the Sea Knight helicopter he was in crashed while on a secret mission to secure Iraqi oil fields.
I hate to see that it's our sacrifices that we all give, not only Brian and my wife Melissa, but the other soldiers and their families, and hopefully there's not many others. But if it'll bring peace to the world, I'm all for it.
To all those who have lost someone in this conflict, our hearts are with you.
All of the Marines on the Sea Knight were brothers in arms at California's Camp Pendleton.
The Marines who gave their lives in Operation Iraqi Freedom join the ranks of men and women who have fought and died to protect America's security and freedom. Captain Ryan Anthony Beaupre, 30, of Bloomington, Illinois. Corporal Brian Matthew Kennedy, 25, of Houston, Texas. Staff Sergeant Kendall Damon Watersby, 29, of Baltimore, Maryland. Major J. Thomas Aubin, 36, of Waterville, Maine.
He told me if something happened, Mom, always remember I died doing what I love.
At 36, Major J. Aubin was an 18-year veteran who had flying in his blood, remembers his mother, Nancy.
Jay was a year or 2 old, and he was flying in the back seat of his dad's Cessna, taking a nap. And he always loved to fly, and this was the way he could make it happen.
Jay told his mother before he left that a war with Iraq was the only option.
I asked him, I said, are you sure that we have to do this? He said, yes, Mom, we absolutely have to do this.
It was the same sentiment expressed by Captain Ryan Beaupre, said his brother Chris and sister Elisa.
I wanted to know if he was okay with what he was going over there for. And he was. He said that this was something that needed to be done.
We always thought of him as a hero, regardless of this war or whatever happened.
But what happened to Kendall Watersby,
my only son,
was something his father Michael wasn't prepared for.
And President Bush, you took my only son away from me.
The feeling of loss is also felt in Oceanside, the home of Camp Pendleton.
Part of me feels that even one life lost is too many. The other part of me knows the reality of war and sacrifice.
From the sands of Iwo Jima to the sands of Iraq, Marines fight and die. Fuad Ajami, our CBS News consultant professor at Johns Hopkins University. At first glance, the core premise of the Bush administration, that this is a world war involving a vast internal crisis of Islam, suggests the necessity of a very long-term American commitment.
Dan, you're absolutely right. In my opinion, and I think some months ago we said this even on this broadcast, this road to Baghdad, it began in Kabul. It was one main highway. It began in Kabul, Afghanistan, and goes all the way to Baghdad. It's really a war now to, in many ways, rid the Muslim world and rid the Arab world in particular of its malignancies. And it's a battle to show, if you will. We have to have a vision. We have to make sure that these people we sent and we put in harm's way and who paid the ultimate sacrifice, as you put it, that there is a vision for it. And the vision is a representative government in Iraq that would be in some way, this is the ambitious vision, a model for the other Arabs. Not a democratic government, but just a representative government, less lethal and more reflective of Iraq's principal communities.
The road led from Kabul to Baghdad.
Right.
The idea is whether, correct me if I'm wrong,
yes,
whether Saddam Hussein is directly connected with al-Qaeda or not is less the point than no one doubted, no one in the administration doubted, very few Americans doubted if he had the chance,
right,
he would do the kind of thing that happened on 9/11.
Absolutely, Dan. What was September 11, 2001? September 11 was about surprise. And who is the master of surprise in the Arab world and in the Muslim world? Saddam Hussein. He surprised Iran in 1980. He surprised Kuwait in 1990. And our president and our leaders decided that they couldn't live in the shadow of that threat and of that possible surprise. The war against Saddam, in my view, began on September 12, 2001. That's when the decision was made that we would fight the war on terror, and then after we take it a step further, we would go all the way to Baghdad.
That we would dislodge the Taliban regime,
absolutely,
put Osama bin Laden on the run, and then move to Baghdad. Fuad Ajami, thanks. So far, Iraqi forces have taken aim at coalition troops in Kuwait perhaps a dozen times with tactical missiles, and so far, as Aaron Moriarty, who is is in Kuwait City, the impact has been at best low. Aaron?
Good morning. Good morning. It's a wet, windy, but very quiet Kuwait. If you call the bombardment of Baghdad shock and awe, you'd have to call what's happening here in Kuwait the last gasp. While it is true that Iraq appears to be aiming a strike at U.S. troops here by aiming missiles here, so far it's been all miss and no hits.
In the past 48 hours in Kuwait City, air raid sirens have sent people scurrying for cover, time after time after time, and kept Captain Wes Russell and his men of the 293rd Infantry Brigade very busy.
As you can hear now, they're saying all clear.
It started Thursday night when Russell got a frantic call from one of his men guarding the nearby seaport.
We're under fire, there's been an explosion. Those were his words.
It shook the windows and everything. We really didn't know where it was coming from or what it was exactly.
The commander on site, Captain Greg Markison, says despite the 293rd's training, the Indiana National Guard unit was caught a bit off guard.
It was very startling, to say the least. We were used at that point, after a day of scuttlers, of hearing it. And when that didn't happen, my first thought was it wasn't a missile, it was a bomb.
Just a very, very quick, loud, sudden whirring noise. Literally just the sound of a high-pitched turbo fan.
Hotel manager Paul Hutton doesn't need official confirmation of the missile. He says it flew right over his head and the Hilton Hotel. How loud?
Quite loud. In fact, one of my colleagues was almost literally thrown out of bed.
How close do you think you came to being hit?
Far too close.
It was not a Scud, we know that.
Dozens of eyewitnesses described an object consistent with a low-flying Chinese-made silkworm missile.
And
how low?
Extremely low. We're talking maximum 150 feet above the ground.
So low that it wasn't picked up by the Patriot anti-missile system and hit without warning. A fact that has this hotel manager feeling jumpy as night falls over Kuwait again.
Dan, I want to make it very clear that when I said that missile hit, it hit the water. So far, none of the missiles that have been launched here at Kuwait have actually hit its mark, which we've been very lucky. The most recent one, which was yesterday, was intercepted by a Kuwaiti Patriot system before it could cause any damage.
Aaron Moriarty reporting live from Kuwait City. Thanks. Let's go back now to CBS News correspondent John Roberts, our regular chief White House correspondent, who's on temporary duty as a combat correspondent with the 1st Marine Division somewhere in the northern part of southern Iraq. John, it's my understanding that you have an opportunity to interview one of the Marines there. Tell us about it.
I do, Dan. We're just in a staging area right now, getting set to roll out in 3 or 4 minutes. But I thought we'd take this opportunity to meet a real Marine. This is kind of Robert Mitchell, who's been kind enough to accompany us and stay close to us as we travel through the southern desert here in Iraq. And the company has already been split up this morning, or the battalion has been split up this morning. Can you tell us kind of what's going on this morning?
Well, first off, last night we had Bravo Company move forward, do a screen to our north. And earlier this morning, Alpha Company pushed forward to do a screen to our west. The rest of the battalion is staying by to follow and trace behind them.
So you've split off a couple of lead elements of this battalion. They've gone forward to check out the terrain ahead, and then you'll bring on the follow-on forces after this?
Exactly, sir.
How is the campaign going so far? I mean, you have a vast experience here in the Gulf area. You're a veteran of Gulf War I.
Yes, sir. Thus far, it's gone pretty much as we planned. Our intelligence officers gave us a very good intelligence before we rolled out yesterday morning. No anticipation we have much enemy forces in our theater, and that so far is exactly how it's unfolded.
Was it surprising to you that there was absolutely no resistance as you came across the border? In fact, between 6 o'clock yesterday morning when we crossed the border and this morning, we have not seen one Iraqi soldier, one piece of Iraqi military equipment other than what was destroyed during the Gulf War.
Somewhat surprising, again, as I said, because of our G2, our intelligence, feeding down the information they did, giving us the indication they did not think there would be any or much enemy in our area. It's exactly how it's unfolded.
Now, do you have a sense that if they're not here, they're somewhere else, or do you have a sense that this campaign may be, in fact, be much easier than some people had laid it out to be?
Personal perception, sir, I think the closer we get to Baghdad, the more we're going to encounter.
Right. And is there anything you could share with us about this morning's operation in terms of where we might be headed?
All I know right now is to the northwest.
The news this morning that the 51st Iraqi Army Division surrendered, how was that taken by the troops?
Overwhelming excitement. I hope it continues to be that way throughout the Iraqi campaign.
All right, very good. Gunner Robert Mitchell, thanks for being with us.
Thanks very much.
We'll see you as we roll on to the north.
John, if I may, could you ask Gunner to stay on there for just one moment? I wanted to ask him something. Could you ask him just a second to hang on?
Stay here just for a second, Gunner Mitchell. Dan Rather would like to ask you something. You can ask it through me. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, thank you. First of all, John, he said, and he paused a long time. I noted that. He doesn't want to tell us where he's going, and I don't really want to know. But he said moving toward the northwest. Is it his expectation that eventually, at some point, the Marines will cross the Euphrates River and get into the Mesopotamia Valley?
Dan is asking, obviously, preserving operational security. Is it the Marines' intention to, at some point in the move forward and the move north, to cross the Euphrates River and get into the Mesopotamia Valley?
To the best of our knowledge right now, our planning right now only has us taking up just south of the Euphrates River. Certainly hoping to move forward after that, but right now it's just up to this side of the Euphrates.
Now, a question that Dan asked me yesterday, and I think you probably want to hear from you as well, is it the Marines' intention to be there at the gates of Baghdad at some point in this campaign?
That I can't answer, sir.
Is that something that you would like to see the Marines do?
Certainly, I think all of us as Marines would like to be at the gates of Baghdad along with our brothers in the Army and the British.
Dan, anything else for Gunner Mitchell?
Yes, John. I don't want to hold him from his work, but there's been some talk, and I've actually seen this piece of machinery and electronics. Does he or any of his men have the so-called robo-pack? That is the little robot that is pack size that can be used to sort of sort out minefields or do a lot of other work, or do they have this latest piece of equipment?
Dan is wondering about a piece of equipment called a robo-pack that you strap on your back that might be used if you're trying to go forward and detect a minefield, figure out where the mines are. Is that a piece of equipment that the Marines carry?
It's a piece of equipment that I wouldn't be familiar with. Our engineer officer would have better information on that.
Right. You're into guns and bombs and that.
I'm in the standard infantry weapons type of environment.
Right. There you go, Dan.
Thank you very much, John, and thank him for hanging on there. John, I have in mind that the Marines were the first into Kuwait City in the 1991 Gulf War, and part of breaking the back of Saddam Hussein's operation in Kuwait was the Marines quickly reaching Kuwait City. You talk, I'm going to ask you sort of what I asked Jim Axelrod before. When you talk to the captains and the sergeants, the Marines who know what's going on, what's really going on.
I don't mean to interrupt you, Dan, but
Sure.
we have to. Dan, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. We have to roll. Let me get back into the vehicle. We have the technology to continue going, so keep asking your question.
Well, do what you have to do. Do what you have to do. Get back in the vehicle, and if you got to roll it, and we'll let you get back in there. Just take a second to do it.
All right, Dan, go ahead.
On. Well, I was remarking, John, that the Marines were the first into Kuwait City in the 1991 Gulf War, but they did that by once they got started, they kept moving. They just kept driving. I get the sense in this operation, and I'm asking you to correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a bit of move forward, then stop, look, listen, regroup, then move forward some more, rather than a pell-mell drive forward.
Dan, I think because this campaign is larger and the terrain that they're operating in is much larger than it was during Gulf War I, that there is that sense of move forward, get a sense of where you are in your position, get a sense of where everyone else is as well. Pause, refuel, make sure that everybody is watered up, fueled up in terms of MREs as well. Get a sense of how the battle plan is changing, because it is changing very quickly, and then you move on from there. Let me just switch to the front camera here as well. I'm pretty boring to look at, so let's get you some terrain that looks a little more interesting. We're heading off, if you will, to catch up with Alpha and Bravo companies, who Gunner Mitchell was saying struck out as a lead element about an hour ago. We've got a combat vehicle in the front. It's called an LAV-25, 25-millimeter cannon on the front of it, same type of cannon that is on the Bradley fighting vehicle, two of those actually out front. Then we're followed by a communications unit called the C-Squared. This is one that can keep in contact with the battalion, with the companies as they go forward, as well as Division Main, and then Gunner Mitchell, who is our escort, is in front of us as well, Dan. But I do agree with you that this is a campaign of moving forward, stopping, regrouping, get an idea of where everybody is, and then move on again. We actually stopped yesterday. We were supposed to only stop for about an hour. We ended up stopping for the entire night. We stopped at about 10 o'clock, and then the lead elements rolled out at about 5 o'clock this morning, and now we, after a wee bit of a delay, are moving out ourselves.
John, I see a tower of some kind up forward to your left at maybe about 11 o'clock. Is that a high line? Is it a communications tower? What is that thing?
It's a power line, Dan, and I don't want to give you the exact location. Actually, what we should probably do is ensure that, and I think if we see just that, we're probably fine, because there is a certain landmark quality to this particular power line. We don't want to show you too much of it because somebody might get a pretty good idea of where we are.
I understand.
But, that is a high-tension power line that's in front of us, Dan. That's correct.
John, about how fast are you going now? Look at the speedometer. How many miles an hour are you traveling along there?
Oh, it's only about 10 miles an hour now, Dan. We just ran into some washboard ruts here along the desert underneath this power line, but we should be starting to tick it up a little bit. I imagine as we chase down the lead group, we'll probably get up to about 40, 50 miles an hour in this run through the desert.
John, when you talk to the captains and sergeants and the other Marines down in the ranks, are they still at a heightened state of worry about the possible use of chemical and biological weapons, or is that beginning, even in a wee small way, to fade in the background of their minds?
I think, Dan, it's a little less so now than it was even when we were in the...
Well, we seem to have lost John's audio there. This video phone has worked amazingly well. I believe we've lost John's audio for the moment.
Dan, do you still have us?
We have you back now, John. We lost you there for a second.
I think we're back now. I think we're back.
Fine. John, one thing
I think it's probably that the high-tension wires interfere with the satellite transmission.
Right. But, John, this gives us an opportunity to say that there were a lot of questions about embedding journalists with U.S. military units before the war actually started. From a distance, it appears to so far have worked extremely well, and one's tempted to give a tip of the Stetson to Tory Clark and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld for reversing the very tight, no access, very little information policy of the Afghanistan campaign and opening up in this one. But I'm interested in your view on the ground and rolling with these Marines, how it's worked.
Well, Dan, I agree with something that you said was a little more than a month ago, I think, as we were preparing for this whole process, that there is a very fine line between being embedded and being entombed. And there was a real question as to whether or not, if we got deep in with the unit as it was rolling through the desert, we'd ever be able to transmit. So what I really have to do is, if you would allow me to, is give a tip of the Stetson to these two fellows. You see Engineer Patrick Starling's hair here in this three-shot, and to Kirk Spitzer, and as well to Randall Joyce, our producer out of London, who's taking a helicopter ride up to the front this morning. They spent an awfully long time not only putting together this extraordinary vehicle, which allows us to broadcast as we travel with the units, but they spent a long time getting to know this unit as well. I came into it about almost 3 weeks ago and started to get to know folks, but they've almost been living with them out here in the desert since the moment that they touched down. There's also a past relationship between.
Well, once again, it's a wonder it didn't happen earlier. We've, as you can see, we lost the audio and got a freeze frame on the video phone. But John Roberts giving us an excellent inside view of what it's like to be with a reconnaissance scout unit up ahead for the U.S. Marine 1st Division. And among the things we learned is that they do intend to go up to the Euphrates River, but right now it's go up to the river, maybe cross it, and maybe not. Now, in from Sky News, affiliated with CBS News in London, Sky News reports a Royal Navy helicopter collision. This is not good news. There's no way to dress it up. We said before, war is hell in a lot of different ways. And 2 Royal Navy Sea King search and rescue helicopters are now reported to have been involved in a mid-air collision over international waters in the Persian Gulf today. 7 crew members are missing. Now, no word on whether anyone was rescued, injured, or killed. What we have and all we have is that 7 crew members are missing as 2 Royal Navy Sea King search and rescue helicopters collided in midair. These things happen. Now, 4 U.S. Marines and I think it was 8 British troopers were killed in the crash of a U.S. Marine helicopter, you recall, about 48 hours ago. We still don't have any information as whether it was knocked down by enemy fire or whether it was mechanical or an accident, although the early indications are that that was probably an accident, not to be confused with the 2 U.S. Marines who were shot dead by Iraqi soldiers over the last 24 to 36 hours. Now, CBS News producer Phil Ittner, he's a producer and one terrific reporter. He's also with the 3rd Infantry Division, where Jim Axelrod reported from a short while ago, although Ittner is in a somewhat different area. He joins us now by phone and has news of a battle today inside Iraq. Phil, tell us about it.
Dan, the battle for An-Nasiriyah is over. The U.S. 3rd Mechanized Infantry Division is announcing this morning that they have defeated the 11th Iraqi Light Infantry Division. In the early morning hours after an extensive fight, one that was unexpected, the U.S. forces have actually taken this city in the southern part of Iraq. Dan?
Well, Phil, this is breaking news of a sort. Now, Al-Nasiriyah, the early intelligence reports is this was a place that the expectation was that they might give up the whole place. We're keeping in mind that this is in basically a Shiite area inside Iraq. But you say that there was a pretty fierce fight there.
I would categorize this, Dan, as medium resistance. It wasn't too heavy, according to the military here, but it was enough for them to have to continually run operations throughout the night. And as you mentioned there, it was unexpected. They came up against the 11th Infantry, light infantry. They had intelligence before going across the border that these soldiers, these Iraqi soldiers, would surrender. They didn't do that. It is suspected from military intelligence here that is because some elements of the Republican Guard had come down to An-Nasiriyah to basically force those soldiers from the 11th to fight. At this point, they are trying to confirm whether or not there are elements of the Republican Guard inside An-Nasiriyah. I should mention also that after these fights, the division, the Iraqi division, was not destroyed. They did eventually surrender, and we are getting preliminary reports, and I want to be very careful about this. We are getting preliminary reports of one Army soldier injured from sniper fire. How serious his injuries are, we don't know at this point, but we are getting reports that at least one U.S. soldier has been injured in this battle.
That is the battle for An-Nasiriyah. Did U.S. tanks engage the defenders, Phil, or do you know?
Yeah, Dan, as a matter of fact, the bulk of the ground fighting here was done by the 3rd Brigade of the 3rd Mechanized Infantry Division. That's a brigade that is predominantly Bradley armored fighting vehicles, but it does contain a contingent of Abrams main battle tanks. They did meet with the enemy at the city, and there was some ground fighting. An awful lot of this was conducted from the air. Many of the elements of the 4th Brigade of the 3rd Mechanized Infantry, which is the Aviation Brigade, were involved in this, utilizing AH-64 Apache longbow helicopters. Dan?
Phil, this is a vivid description you've just given us of what appears to be the biggest battle inside Iraq so far. I've not heard anything that approaches this, and I am trying to keep it in context and give it some perspective. That you say that the resistance, when I described it as possibly a fierce fight, you said, well, it was a fight. There was some considerable resistance, but this sounds like the biggest battle inside Iraq thus far. First of all, tanks were used to dislodge and engage the defenders. Attack helicopters, including the Apache longbow, used. Have you seen any prisoners of war as a result of this now taking of this town along the banks of the Euphrates? Any POWs?
Dan, I have not seen any enemy prisoners of war. As I mentioned, I'm actually with the air element of the 3rd Mechanized Infantry Division, so we are at a staging area a little ways away from the front lines. However, I am being told by military intelligence officers here that, yes, enemy prisoners of war have been taken, and at this hour what they are doing is trying to sift through them to try and find any elements of the Republican Guard, because, as I mentioned, one of the questions here is, why did the 11th put up such a fight? And one of the leading thoughts behind that is because of the presence of the Republican Guard. But I can, yes, tell you that according to U.S. military intelligence officers, enemy prisoners of war have been taken.
Phil, when I spoke to you this afternoon when you were on the move with the 3rd Infantry, we were talking about another bit of combat which happened about 24 hours ago. I believe it was Lieutenant Colonel Williams out of Colorado who said, speaking of Al-Nasiriyah, that there were reports that human shields had been pressed into service by some of the incoming Republican Guard people. Any reports of were human shields in fact used?
Yeah, that's correct. We are getting reports from inside An-Nasiriyah that what the Iraqis had done is position their military vehicles around things like hospitals and schools and mosques. It is our understanding that that was one of the ways they were trying to protect themselves. The U.S. military is being very, very careful about engaging anything that might be culturally sensitive. I've seen the rules of engagement here for this conflict, one that was a card that has been administered to every soldier in this army, and one of the major points is do not engage anything in or around a mosque, a school, a hospital, unless for self-defense. So this tactic made things a little bit more difficult. I don't want to overemphasize how much more difficult, but it did make things more difficult for the forces as they moved into that city.
Phil Littner, a terrific bit of reporting you're doing for us, and we very much appreciate. The battle for Nasiriyah is over. The United States 3rd Infantry Division has, for all intents and purposes, according to our man on the scene, Phil Littner, a very careful reporter, has taken Nasiriyah. Some prisoners have been taken. There was a fight for the city, which is not expected. And this is an area, and one of the more ancient areas of civilization, in the so-called cradle of civilization, right there along the Euphrates River. Let's turn to our CBS News military analyst, Colonel Mitch Mitchell. Colonel, now this is news that they've taken.
Yes, it is.
That this business of human shields, is this or is this not likely to be Saddam Hussein's plan for defending Baghdad, to put his equipment and his best people in and around mosques, hospitals, schools, private homes, and when necessary, use non-volunteer human shields?
I'm sure that's his tactic, Dan, and it also appears that his tactic is to send out some of the Republican Guard officers and other elements of his security forces to enforce his position of staying and fighting. These units probably have been bolstered by that, or at least intimidated by the Republican Guard presence. They go out to all the units and they say, you will stand and fight or else. And I think that's probably what happened here.
Interesting. Republican Guards may be hiding, to use a popular phrase these days, embedding themselves with the Iraqi regular army soldiers, mostly conscripts, as well as among civilians.
That's correct. And they have an intimidation factor that is long-standing, and so you can expect when they go with the regular units will probably stand up and fight unless they decide to shoot them, which we're getting reports now that from some of the British contingents that possibly some of the recruits shot some officers who wanted to have them fight against the British, and in fact, they didn't want to. So we may see some of that too. The defection is going to occur in many ways.
I want to come back to you a little later on. Thanks for that, putting this in perspective, the taking of Nasiriyah. Now, former UN Arms Inspector Tim McCarthy is with us, and do you know this area of Iraq down there along the Euphrates?
I do, Dan. I've been down there a few times.
What can you tell us about it? What size town is this?
Well, it's not a huge town, but it is an important town, as you know, on the road to Baghdad. It is generally in the Shia area, in this Najaf, Karbala sort of triangle. In terms of its military importance, it's very interesting. There's a very important airfield, command and control node, called Talil Air Base, which is right near Nasiriyah. What's interesting about that is we had information as inspectors, actually, that Iraq had actually deployed some of these drones to that very airbase, Talil Air Base, that we've all been worried about, that, for example, Secretary Powell talked about, and the concern was that they were going to use these drones for chemical and biological delivery. Now, this was done in 1997. We have direct information that, in fact, they forward deployed these drones. So this is good news. I don't have no information that, in fact, in this case, they were deployed at Talil in this particular instance, but we do know that in past crises, these drones were deployed there.
Well, this is an interesting point. We've been sort of waiting, hoping it never comes, but anticipating the moment when Saddam Hussein, in one way or the other, tries to deliver chemical and/or biological weapons on the advancing U.S.-led troops, in this case primarily the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division. What you're saying is there's no doubt in your mind he has drones capable of doing exactly that.
There's no doubt in my mind. And in fact, when you see some of these, that's exactly what some of these strikes in Baghdad and why they're so important. And we wanted to show, in fact, what these strikes are hitting in Baghdad, and we took some of this imagery and matched it up with some satellite imagery and some of the sites that I've actually been to in Baghdad, and you'll see the connection here. This first site is the presidential secretariat, especially the executive branch of the president, and it's the site of the second most important man in Iraq, and you can see the strike there. And I'll come back to that in a moment. This second strike shows the Mukhabarat headquarters, the intelligence headquarters, and basically they handle all the foreign intelligence operations in Iraq, and you can see that strike there. Now, if we talk about this, the reason why I mention this presidential secretariat, the person who is Saddam's right-hand man, the presidential secretariat, his name is Abid Hamid Mahmoud. He is literally the gatekeeper for Saddam, and he is very much in the chain of command. Our belief is that he's very much in the chain of command for both hiding weapons of mass destruction and for the actual use thereof. So we connect the issue of Talil back to this striking these targets in Baghdad and disrupting command and control for chem and bio use.
Wonderful use of the graphics. I like the satellite shot, the location, and then showing what they're hitting. Tim, you've had a tremendous amount of experience with weaponry. What about the claims that these new weapons are so much more precise, so much more surgical than the ones in the Gulf War? I want to state this gently, but frankly, that we were told much the same thing during the Gulf War. How much of this should we believe about the precision of these weapons being used against specific Iraqi targets now? I
mean, my sense is just looking, and we've looked over this footage fairly carefully over the last couple hours, and looking at these very important sites, for example, again, this presidential secretariat site, right on target. The Mukhabarat compound that I mentioned, this general intelligence compound, it's actually a large compound composed of many buildings, and from the view that we have, the bearing we took, we can tell that they hit right on the right set of buildings that contain really the active elements of the intelligence service.
Let me turn to Mitch for just a moment. Mitch, what happened to the idea that you come in with overwhelming air power for at least a few days and inflict tremendous attrition and then come in perhaps quickly behind it with ground forces? That hasn't happened. If anything, it's been the other way around. Big ground force invasion with, sometime later, a big air attack.
Well, we hear that General Tommy Franks wanted to get after those oil fields quickly, and that may be one of the reasons why the ground attack was launched. But you're quite correct. When you don't have a softening up process before you attack ground forces, you can expect stiffer resistance. And I think that's what we're finding right now. It's not something we can't overcome, but it's certainly going to slow down the operation a bit. And of course, it will always produce more casualties. The longer you fight, the more casualties you get.
Thanks, Colonel. The message has already been broadcast to Iraqi forces over and over by U.S. planners. Surrender for the sake of your honor, to save your lives, to save the lives of your family. It's a message that more and more Iraqis appear to be taking to heart. CBS News correspondent Russ Mitchell is here with late details about some who are giving up the fight. Russ?
Dan, 8,000 more Iraqi troops are now in the hands of Allied forces, and the Pentagon says this is a big one. All part of the Pentagon's very aggressive campaign to get the opposition, both military and civilian, to switch rather than fight.
Okay. All right, U.S. military officials are optimistic that scenes like this in Iraq become more common over the next few days. These are civilians, but Friday's white flag by Iraq's regular 51st Division marked the biggest surrender so far of the war and was the first time the commander of an Iraqi division has given up. The 51st was a mechanized division, set to have 200 tanks before the war began. It was considered one of the better equipped and trained in Iraq's regular army. These former soldiers now become the responsibility of their captors, and the Pentagon is predicting more Iraqis are not far behind.
Officers and soldiers in the field will increasingly see that their interests lie not in dying for a doomed regime, but in helping the forces of Iraq's liberation.
And of course, the men who surrendered on Friday were not part of Saddam Hussein's fabled Republican Guard. The group picked up on Friday was said to be pretty much a ragtag group. They were hungry and they were tired. Even the Pentagon admits it's going to be tougher to crack the Republican Guard troops outside of Baghdad, which is yet another reason that the Allies are hitting Baghdad so hard with all that firepower from the air. Dan?
And thanks, Russ. And we want to mention again that Baghdad, for the first time in the war, has been hit sometime during the daylight hours of now Saturday, Iraqi and Baghdad daylight time. Unexpected trouble in Iraq's north. Turkey Despite the protests of President Bush and the White House, Turkey says it is sending more ground troops into northern Iraq. CBS News correspondent Alan Pizzi is there. Alan, bring us up to date on this potentially complicating and even dangerous situation.
Good morning, Dan. Well, we understand that a vanguard of at least 1,500 Turkish troops have already crossed the border, and more would appear to be on their way. That's in addition to the 18,000 troops the Turks already have in this country, making a buffer zone along their border to fight Kurdish guerrillas who are against Turkish rule in southern Turkey. Now, that's a very complicating issue because, as we've been mentioning, the Kurds say that they will fight any Turks who come in here. They'd like to fight Saddam. They'd like to be on the American side, but their biggest interest at the moment, they say, will be fighting the Turks. It's a whole new can of worms because, as the Kurds point out, if the Turks can come in, why not the Iranians? And indeed, there is yet another local issue that's now being complicated, bringing complications to the Americans. A battle has broken out just a little ways from here near the town of Halabja, where about 500 fighters from Ansar al-Islam, an Islamic group that admits links to al-Qaeda, is now in a pitched battle with forces of the Kurdish group that's around here. The Kurds say the attack began with the help of the Americans. About 5 cruise missiles slammed into that area overnight. And now Kurdish sources tell us that American advisors are helping their troops to attack Ansar al-Islam. You may remember that Colin Powell, in his speech to the United Nations, accused Ansar of having links with Saddam Hussein. Ansar denied that, although it was later said that perhaps some of Saddam's agents may have infiltrated Ansar. But Ansar does openly say that they sympathize with and imply that they have direct links to al-Qaeda. So it's a fight the Americans would I think, want to have go on, but perhaps not at this time. This is becoming a very complicated little region up here at the moment, Dan.
Well, it historically has been a very complicated, as you say, little region up there. And to give this some perspective, Ellen, I'm going to put in one of our cards, which will give our viewers a chance to review the map. Where Alan is roughly up in this Kurdish area. The Kurds are Muslim. They're a mixture of Shiite and Sunni Muslims, but they are ethnically different from the rest of the country. The Sunni Muslims, led by Saddam Hussein, who dominate in the central part of the country and the western part of the country, and different still from the Shiite Muslims in the southern part, in that the Kurds are not historically and ethnically Arabs per se. It's a very complicated history, and I won't try to give it all here, but the point is that the Turks up here, they have a Kurdish population in their country. The Iranians also have a Kurdish population, and this area roughly is oil rich. Yes, the big oil field is down the south, the Ramallah oil field, but there's already an operating oil field in here, and they're known to be tremendous oil reserves in here. Now, the Kurds, in the best of all worlds, they would like to very much to have their own independent country. The Turks say no to that. The Iranians say no to that. Saddam Hussein has long said no to that, and in fact the now incoming U.S.-led invasion force says no to that, that they want to hold the country as a whole together. Now, the importance of Turkey moving additional troops into this area, as Alan Pizzi is pointing out so well in his reporting, is that it's an enormously complicating factor. Now, Alan, I want to come back to something you reported I hadn't heard reported before, and that is that some of the American missile attacks today were directed at al-Qaeda forces up in that northern Iraq area, al-Qaeda forces that now have done battle with the Kurds?
That's right, Dan. It's a small group, Ansar al-Islam. They're not directly al-Qaeda, but they have links to and they sympathize with. They're said to be about 500 of them. They claim that all they want to do is bring what they would call proper Islamic rule to this part of the country. Obviously, as you said, the Kurds are Sunni Muslims and also Chaldean Christians. They have a high degree of religious tolerance, and they're not interested in Islamic fundamentalism in any way, shape, or form. They consider these Islamists to be a blot upon their area, and so they've been itching to get at them anyway. And the fact that we're hearing that at least 5 cruise missiles went in shows that the Americans are quite happy to help them. But as I say, perhaps not now and in this way. It's a distraction. Ansar was contained in their little pocket along the Iranian border. They weren't causing much of a problem. But now that the fight has started, it, as you said, just makes a complicated situation even more complicated. When the Americans are trying to get ground troops in here to push their way down to take those oil fields around Kirkuk and Mosul that are so important, before Saddam can do anything about them. And now they've got yet another fight, plus the Turks coming in. It's the proverbial can of worms, Dan.
Well, battlefields are always chaotic, but the overall battlefield of Iraq, partly because of these additional Turkish troops moving into northern Iraq, is becoming even more chaotic than had been generally predicted. We want to point out that you may want to keep an eye on the 173rd airborne outfit that's stationed in Italy, because now, if it holds, that Turkey says it will allow overflights of its country. It's not allowing, at least not yet and still not yet, ground U.S. troops to be stationed in Turkey, but the deal apparently has finally been put together for overflights of Turkey. And if that's true, the 173rd could come out of Italy and could be airlifted into that section of northern Iraq and be called upon to, in effect, keep the Kurds, the Iraqis, those al-Qaeda connected operatives up there all sort of away from one another and try to deal with the al-Qaeda connections in that part of the world. Now, it's also possible that the 101st Airborne, which is still down in Kuwait, could possibly be used for that same bit of business. So that's something to keep an eye on as we go along. This is the picture of Baghdad in daylight. As the daylight hours go by in Baghdad, live picture right now, it's past 9:30 on the Saturday morning there. You may want to note that the heaviest bombing of the war was started yesterday. That's on the Muslim Sabbath day of the week, Friday. And there were those who said, well, the United States would not want to put on the shock and awe show on the Muslim Sabbath. Well, that, like a lot of other predictions, went by the boards. Baghdad was hit on this Saturday morning their time in daylight for the first time by some bombing, but obviously a little bit of traffic is beginning to move around the city. There have been no reports of bombing in or around Baghdad in the last few hours. In a notable success, U.S. forces captured many key facilities in Iraq's southern oil fields, preventing sabotage by Iraqi troops. This was, as was mentioned before, one of the main goals of the early invasion. Only a handful of oil wells, no oil fields, were torched. And as CBS's Lee Cowan reports, that success is thanks in large part to Special Operations Commandos working under cover of darkness.
They are the most dangerous of the dangerous missions, special ops. So secret, pictures like these are almost unheard of. For security reasons, all we're allowed to report tonight is that this team was preparing to storm key oil fields inside Iraq to prevent the hellfire that had become Saddam's signature.
How difficult a mission is it? Everything we do out here is pretty tough. It's flying in the desert at night is challenging. But as I said, we're very well trained, and I think we'll step up and do just fine.
Failure here isn't an option. The welfare of the invading troops soon to follow depends on how this team shapes the battlefield.
It's exciting enough on its own, but it's nice to know that we're helping kick the whole thing off.
At the mission briefing, their commanding officer put it bluntly.
And it'll be difficult out there. There's a lot of stuff in the air, and there's a lot of things going on. So you've got to be heads up.
But just moments after that briefing ended, another gas alert, the 7th code red of the day, full chemical gear required. In the background, the sound of what we were told were Patriots knocking the incoming missiles out of the sky. When the all clear was finally given, small teams board the choppers for the trip into enemy territory. Equipment is checked and double-checked. Then it's time to wait, to focus, and to pray.
When Special Operations Forces talk about operating under the cloak of darkness, they mean pitch dark. This is a refueling stop less than 2 miles from the Iraqi border. Helicopters land here, refuel, and take off again for the border, all without a single light in sight.
Except for grains of sand turned into sparks by the chopper's whirling rotor. We can't show you the end of this mission. We can tell you it was a success. The Pentagon confirmed Iraq's southern oil fields are under U.S. control. Only a handful were lost to sabotage, and the troops we went with all made it home. Lee Cowan, CBS News, somewhere near the Iraq-Kuwait border.
And that's a rare piece of journalism. I can't recall the last time I saw any piece done for television about the special operations people. They generally will shoot you, literally, if you bring a camera too close to them. So just keep in mind that that's a rare piece. The mystery still hovering over the early days of this war is whither Saddam Hussein. The Pentagon continues to insist it's confident Saddam Hussein was in that bunker destroyed with the war's first strike. But the CIA also confirms it was Saddam's voice on the videotape seen within hours of the attack. And today, Saddam Hussein and at least one of his sons, believed to be the younger of his two sons, were shown on videotape again on Iraqi TV. Now, there's some questions when the videotapes were made. There's some question of whether they ever appeared live on TV. This is one of those things about you can argue it a lot of different ways. But the links to which Saddam Hussein and others in his regime will go to survive are, by some accounts, nothing less than astonishing. Susan Spencer now on why knowing what's real and who's who can be very difficult in Iraq.
38-year-old Iraqi exile Latif Yahia has unique insight into how the Iraqi regime uses body doubles. After all, he was one.
He made me hate my life.
For 4.5 years, he doubled for Saddam's older son, Uday. The real Uday is on the left, Latif is on the right. It's clear the Iraqis have this down pat.
I don't go and apply for this job.
Interviewed this week in London, Latif says his nightmare started in 1987. Uday, an old school friend, approached him with a bizarre job offer. How would he like to be one of Saddam's sons?
And he said, no, I'm not joking. What do you think to be Saddam's son?
When Latif declined, guards threw him into a tiny cell, painted red, with no toilet. A week later, Uday upped the ante.
Now, what do you think? Do you work with me or I bring your sisters here?
Latif feared his sister would be raped.
And I start shaking, and I say to him, look, give me a piece of paper and I sign for you what you want. Just leave my family alone.
First came the physical transformation. A dentist made artificial teeth to copy Uday's overbite.
They cut all my teeth till the gum, and they take Uday's teeth and fix it in my mouth. In this moment, I can't close my mouth anymore.
Plastic surgeons gave him a new Uday chin, and for months he studied videotapes to learn Uday's mannerisms. He had to learn to smoke, Uday smoked, and to drink. Uday did a lot of that.
In this moment, I never smoked in my life. I started smoking. I never drink because I come from a religious family. I start drinking.
The worst part, he says, was that psychologically he actually had to become Uday, a violent, sadistic personality. Latif says he was forced to watch rape and torture.
They show me how they torture people. They rape the woman.
Latif told Sports Illustrated he had to watch Uday torture an Olympic boxer for losing a match, shocking him with an electric prod and then slashing him with a razor. Latif never saw the boxer again. But the final test in his transformation was meeting Saddam Hussein, his new father. And Saddam had some advice.
He say, God gave me 2 sons. You are now the 3rd. Just don't make me angry.
Latif played his role for almost 5 years, seen here as Uday on this TV special. Here visiting troops in Kuwait. During the Gulf War, Latif was badly injured. The Western press reported Uday's death. At times, Latif admits he rather enjoyed the perks of being Uday, but eventually his ruthless boss turned on him.
21 days he put me in prison, torturing me from 6 in the morning till 6 in the evening. You see just the blood coming from my back, the blood from my face, from everywhere.
Fearing for his life, Latif escaped through Kurdistan.
As opposed to taking them prisoner.
He lives today in Manchester, England, and he is watching this war intensely. He scrutinized the videotape released after the first attack, and though the CIA may think this is the real Saddam, Latif disagrees.
He's not Saddam. Because I know Saddam very well, and I know the double very well.
The West, he says, has been fooled before. Take these 1992 pictures of Saddam swimming in the Tigris. Latif says he knew this was not the real Saddam for what he did not see.
Saddam, he have tattoo here with Iraqi flag and Iraq down.
Latif is convinced that the swimming Saddam and the puffy man making this week's statement are one and the same, one of 4 doubles he knows of. And Latif predicts that Saddam will keep on using doubles to make it almost impossible for the U.S. to know for sure who is dead and who's alive. As for Latif, he hates Saddam, and he also hates this war. Fearing for his family trapped in Baghdad.
And this is why I am against the war. I want to see them again, alive.
And in an Iraq without Uday and Saddam Hussein.
You want to keep in mind that the CIA now says, and the position of the United States government is, that the man seen on the videotape, regardless of when the videotape may have been made, just after the attack on that bunker the first night, was indeed Saddam Hussein. That's based on such things as a careful voice analysis and also such things as distance between the eyes, size of the earlobes, that kind of thing. So the U.S. government position now is that they think Saddam Hussein was in that bunker that was hit. They believe, at least the Washington Post quotes some high sources as saying they believe he may have been carried out on a gurney and was injured in some way. So the question arises, well, if they're certain, fairly certain it was Saddam Hussein, could the videotape have been prepared in advance? So if you want to know where at CBS News we come out, we're agnostic. We neither believe nor disbelieve that Saddam Hussein is alive. We'll say that David Chater in Baghdad said that it was his opinion, he's seen Saddam many times, that Saddam Hussein is still alive and is still making, albeit a desperate effort, to remain in control, for whatever that might be worth. Our old friend, former CIA official and the man who led the U.S. effort to help the people in Afghanistan repel the Soviet invaders back in the 1980s is here with us, Milt Bearden. Milt, there are a lot of questions I want to ask you, but given the time constraints, let me ask you about this. Instead of a tremendous aerial bombardment to start, followed shortly by a tremendous push, overwhelming invasion, a picture is emerging of a go for a while, stop, look, and listen. Basra has not yet been captured. The troops are nowhere near Baghdad yet. What are the chances that a Saddam Hussein, or if he isn't alive, those who remain in power, will begin to say, you know what, we've taken their best first punch and we're still here?
They very well could miscalculate like that. That bothers me too. We've been trying a number of things that were all worth trying. We've been getting our lines into battalion, brigade, division commanders of the Republican Guards, hitting them on their cell phones, working as much as we can to get capitulations without actually going in and having to take the cities. Taking a city is the least attractive choice in any war situation. We've also got a number of political considerations, whether it's the lack of the traditional allies. We've got the American public that is out on the streets. We've got a number of things to do to build a coalition to rebuild Iraq, and I think we're trying to handle all those political issues as we move towards Baghdad. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, that it's quite possible that they will see us calibrating this war in such a manner and interpret it as a lack of resolve. And I think that's a mistake for them, but I think we also have to start thinking about that now as we say, well, we did partial shock and awe, we didn't do big shock and awe. I think the next 12 to 14 hours are going to become very important in that regard.
We have only about a minute left. Let's talk about the effect of all this on worldwide terrorism, whether it's al-Qaeda or something else. Is that danger real and present still or beginning to fade?
There's still going to be the danger of the random attack. I assume that Saddam Hussein had dispatched teams as he did in 1991. They were the gang that couldn't shoot straight. They left Baghdad on sequential passports and got rolled up in a heartbeat. But I always would say that even the blind pig will find the acorn. So let's assume that Saddam may have gotten a little smarter, that his intelligence services may have been a little more with it this time. So we have to pay attention to that. Certainly they're going to try to put some mines on some American ships, and they're not going to succeed at that. But somebody will blow up a McDonald's or a Haagen-Dazs or try to hit an embassy somewhere. Whether they can do anything big in the United States, I kind of doubt it.
Neil Bearden, thanks. One of the Pentagon's stated goals in this campaign is to preserve as much of Iraq's oil riches as possible for the benefit of the Iraqi people. Now, that was apparently one factor in the decision to move up the coalition ground assault, hoping to keep Iraqi troops from setting the oil fields on fire. Troy Roberts has more on the efforts to prevent it from all going up in smoke.
Coalition forces acted quickly today to secure Iraq's oil reserves, but the damage had already begun. About 12 oil wells were set ablaze. Near the city of Ramallah, plumes of black smoke could be seen rising for miles. But the Pentagon later reported that American troops had taken control of the vital oil fields in the south.
Several are still on fire. Several are pouring oil onto the ground. We would intend to, in fairly short order, have the people that know how to repair those wells in there and putting the fires out.
The Pentagon had long feared Saddam Hussein would begin destroying Iraqi oil production to slow a U.S.-led attack.
Will you set fire to the oil fields?
Iraqi television reports the government denies torching the oil wells. And just last month, in an interview with Dan Rather, Saddam promised to protect the country's petroleum wealth.
Iraq does not burn its own wealth, and it does not destroy its own dams.
But it's feared that many of Iraq's 1,600 wells may have been booby-trapped with explosives. The scorched earth tactic devastated Kuwait in 1991 as Iraqi troops retreated in the first Gulf War and set more than 700 oil wells on fire. The trail of fire and smoke created an environmental Armageddon that continues to plague the country.
Could you go tomorrow?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Get under it, son.
Oil field firefighters from Texas, like Pat Campbell, spent months battling those blazes in Kuwait 12 years ago.
Now go up, go up.
Those same teams are training now, and they're ready to go.
It's just a fire coming out of a hole in the ground. And as long as there's pipe there, we can put something on it and stop it.
The financial stakes this time are much greater. Iraqi oil fields are estimated to be worth more than $112 billion, a resource critical to the country's post-war recovery and a prime Allied objective.
To secure Iraq's oil fields and resources, which belong to the Iraqi people and which they will need to develop their country after decades of a neglect by the Iraqi regime.
The U.S. depends on Iraq for just 2% of its crude, but a lengthy disruption in Iraqi oil production could have devastating worldwide consequences. John Kingston is an oil analyst for the Platts Company.
There is enough spare capacity in the world to overcome the loss of the roughly 2 million barrels a day that Iraq was putting onto the world market, but there's not much more than that.
The firepower striking Baghdad and the lightning speed of American ground troops have Wall Street betting on a quick victory over Saddam. The price of oil dropped to a low today that hasn't been seen in months. Troy Roberts, CBS News, New York.
In the Persian Gulf, it's Operation Iraqi Freedom. Here at home, Liberty Shield is the name given the operation to protect Americans against domestic terrorism. And here in New York City, ground zero in the attacks of 9/11 and where the terror threat has been at high ever since its Operation Atlas. Harold Dow with more now on an anti-terror team that's feeling the weight of the world.
As American bombs rained down on Baghdad,
All the way up, sir. All the way up, all the way up. Keep going, keep going.
the NYPD was making sure New Yorkers were neither shocked nor awed by any terrorist bombs that may suddenly appear here.
We have been targeted in New York City 4 times in the last decade, unlike any other city in America.
Under Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly's security plan, Operation Atlas, many signs of stepped-up security are plainly visible. But one of the most important elements, the NYPD bomb squad, prefers to keep a low profile.
Is there a unit in the field trying to raise us?
This is not a job. I thought it was Launch 4 or something like that. This is a mission. I'll check, Mike.
Lieutenant Mark Torrey runs the bomb squad, the country's oldest and largest. He spent the first 26 hours of the war in his office.
Did you get home last night?
No, I stayed over.
Stayed over?
Yeah.
Long night?
It's the kind of night that you don't go home.
This week alone, his men have responded to more than 20 calls. Fortunately, no bombs were found.
The volume of calls, not only to the squad, but as far as the calls that are coming over the radio, they're absolutely picking, I'm sure.
The unit uses robots and bomb-sniffing dogs. But when a suspicious package is discovered, it comes down to one of Torrey's men in this 90-pound protective suit.
Most of it's Kevlar. We have steel plating.
Are you afraid?
Absolutely.
You don't mind saying that?
Absolutely not. If you didn't say you were afraid, then you're a little bit psycho.
Don't make it so obvious.
Last night, the squad helped conduct a drill for patrolmen, one that teaches them how to deal with suspicious packages.
You see it? You seen that?
Found in the subway.
You don't want to go near it. You don't want to touch it. Hey, that would have been the last sound I heard.
The drill went smoothly.
A lot of the mistakes that we made weeks ago, we're not making anymore. So I'm really happy with the way this went.
But just hours ago, it was the real thing.
We're going to redirect traffic down 61st.
Someone was taking pictures in a bank.
There's a black satchel sitting on that counter.
And left this bag.
Get ready to suit up and do your thing. Sir! Officer, remove.
Police evacuate everyone on the block.
You got it now. Okay.
The bomb tech goes in. The police wait. And to everyone's relief, it turns out to be a false alarm.
We determined there was no explosives in it, but some personal property.
How'd you feel going toward it? Nervous?
Good. Good. It's exciting. Get back to the office. Good job.
But in a city on edge, there's no time to relax.
This is not something that is going to end irrespective of what happens in Iraq. We're going to be fighting a very cunning and patient foe for a long time.
Harold Dow. It's now been confirmed to CBS News that 2 Royal Navy Sea King search and rescue helicopters, British helicopters, were in a mid-air collision over international waters in the Gulf today, and 7 crew members previously listed as missing are now confirmed as having died in that accident. As we close a day that saw the first devastating display of shock and awe, Baghdad is burning again. The hope is that such barrages will, quote, decapitate the Iraqi leadership while demonstrating the futility of continuing to fight the United States. The assurances from Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and other U.S. officials are that great care is being taken to use precision weapons so as to minimize civilian casualties. Similar hopes were expressed before and during the first Gulf War, hopes that, despite the best of intentions, were not always borne out. Technology has progressed mightily between then and now, and the need to limit civilian casualties has never been more integral to strategy, let alone moral concerns, than it is in this war, portrayed so often as targeted at Saddam Hussein's regime rather than the Iraqi people. So as a new day progresses in Iraq, let us hope that daylight reveals that shock and awe has shocked, awed, and killed its intended targets. There'll be more about all this on this CBS station as time goes along, and of course on your regular CBS affiliated station newscasts. There'll be special broadcasts on CBS News tomorrow. That is in the early morning hours after daylight on Saturday morning and throughout the weekend. For CBS News, Dan Rather reporting. I'll see you along the trail.